Welcome to the stage, Alison Butters.
Have you ever had a time when you felt uncomfortable in your own skin? A feeling that you couldn't quite put your finger on? It was there, it percolated, it was stronger at certain times, and you couldn't reconcile what that feeling was? I would invite you to explore and be curious about that feeling during our time together today. My name is Alison. I am a change advocate and a reforming people pleaser. I haven't told you what I do because I'm not a big fan of labels. I'm actually an international life coach, but that doesn't tell you who I am. That tells you what I do. What I do is actually help change people's lives and take them from one place to another. But I've never been a big fan of labels. I'm not sure why. There felt like a restriction around that. And again, we're all beautiful, amazing human beings. Why does society try to keep us in a box? It feels like we're restricted, and that's not what I want for anybody. So today, I would like us to look at a time when I felt even more restricted and I couldn't work out what that restriction actually was. I came across a beautiful quote a couple of months ago, and for some reason that quote, it caused a shift in me, and it took some while to work that through. That quote was a Rumi quote. Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet and scholar. The quote is, "Why do we stay in the prison when the door was wide open? Why do we stay in the prison when the door is wide open?" I wasn't sure what happened. There was something resonated about that. It may resonate with you, but what that did, I was working through a lot of things at that time, going through a lot of self-awareness, and it really struck a chord. It might strike a chord with you. And what it did for me, it took me back to a time when I knew that I was in prison. And that uncomfortable feeling, although all of those feelings, they were actually really raw and really emotional and visceral. And I had to address those feelings. There's been choices I've made in my life, choices when I look back, and I'm responsible for being in my own prison, being in my own emotional prison. There was choices that I have made that I look back on now, and I know that they would have had a significant impact and would have changed not just my life, but everybody I love around me. Those choices that I took because I didn't know a way out of that prison. I was drowning in emotional pain. I felt trapped. I couldn't work out how to get out. There was no way I could navigate. So at that point in time, I just felt that the only way out of that prison that was of my own making was in a box. I love my life now, the life that I have now. I'm so grateful, and I am so blessed for everything that I have at this point in time. Things could have been significantly different. And I look back, not with regret, but the things I want to implore and invite you today, when I look back at that Rumi quote, and what really resonated with me, is that I can give people the gift of time, because it was 20 years that I was in that prison unnecessarily. And by us having a discussion today and sharing my story, I would implore you to think about and look at things that you might feel that you are imposing your own restrictions, you may feel trapped too. Ironically, it was in March 2018 that my body finally gave up on me. I was taken to hospital in March 2018. It was as though I was having a heart attack. The symptoms were replicating a heart attack. I was actually saturated in cortisol. My body was giving up on me. Cortisol is a stress hormone. And because I hadn't addressed that prison cell, my body had just decided enough was enough. And I had to get to the point where things need to change. You may be at a point where you need to change. That was a point for me. In the ambulance going to hospital, my son saw the fear in my eyes. I'd never want to put my family through that again. I was in hospital for 12 days, and once I was discharged from hospital, I knew that my life had to change, and I really had to go inward to do that. This isn't a story of mung beans and meditation. I'm not that big fan of mung beans. Meditation is a daily practice for me now, something I never thought I would actually do. My family looked at me when I was going through that phase after I'd came out of hospital. How are you going to sit still for more than 5 minutes? And they're right. In my corporate role, I was like Tigger on amphetamines. I never stopped. I hardly slept. I was always doing something. But that busyness was for a reason. It's because that uncomfortableness that was percolating, I didn't want to address it, and I didn't want to deal with it. But self-care became my salvation. It's something I'd not done previously. Globally at the moment, I think the market for the expenditure for self-care is $450 billion globally. That's fantastic, and I'm a huge advocate of self-care. But if you're just constantly looking outward instead of going inward, that is just a recipe for misery. You really need to turn the lens inward, and that's what I would like to share with you today, to really look and evaluate at where you're at and to help you perhaps look at things slightly differently. After I'd left hospital and I changed and I put different habits, etc. in place, my life began to change, and those prison bars were still there, but they were starting to evaporate, because through that crucible of pain that I'd been in, that I hadn't really acknowledged, the self-care was carving out a different capacity, a capacity for self-love, self-worth, and that came from that self-care. I never had that previously. In my corporate world, I existed on peppermint tea and cigarettes. It just wasn't something I didn't value myself, and that's really what kept me in that prison. And what I'd implore in my clients today is I can give you that gift of time, because when I looked back on that Rumi quote and the reason why it caused that internal shift in me is because time is the most precious commodity that we have. It's only the most precious commodity if we use it wisely. And I don't regret my life. I love my life. I'm really evangelical now, even though I'm agnostic. Self-care is something that I advocate for my clients first and foremost. And it's really important that we do that. But the reasons, if you can have the gift of time, and that's what I'd implore you to do today and what I'd invite you to do. You may have had times where you're not sure where that uncomfortableness comes from, but it's really because you're not being authentic. You're not being your true self, and you're not aligned with your values. I know that now. That's my experience. Your experience may be different. Your prison bars, they will be different for you too. But there's things, and there's a commonality, and there's a golden thread throughout that. So what I've learned, and this is how I help and support my clients now, with that recognition and that awareness, then what happens is you can move forward and you start to do things slightly differently, and there's a regeneration that happens. But you really have to have that uncomfortableness first. You must sit within it. You've got to be like the bison in the storm. If you don't turn inward and you don't sit with that uncomfortableness and that pain and that visceral, emotional stuff, you are not going to move forward. But if you do that, you have that recognition, that self-awareness, and you have that, you then come to a renaissance. And it's absolutely beautiful. And that's when we are aligned with what we are. Eudaimonia is a term that I use throughout my coaching. And that's what I want to give my clients. I want them to have a life they want to lead, not one they want to leave. And that's when that release comes. When you are authentic and you are living within your values, you have that release. But the key isn't fully turned in the lock at that time. It's not quite there, because the other element that I've learned is that of forgiveness. Forgiveness is really, it's a difficult concept, whether you're forgiving yourself or whether you're forgiving other people. I needed to forgive myself. And once I'd forgiven myself, that lock, that key in that lock was truly turned. And then I realized that that prison cell that I was in, if I just looked in a slightly different direction, the door was always open. And that's what I'd implore and invite you to do, is just to turn around. If you get help, support and guidance, instead of suppressing all of those feelings, I did everything I could to suppress those feelings, did all of the traditional things, drink, drugs, work, all of those addictions, and I can tell you that they don't go away. You really have to sit within that crucible at some point in time. And once you do, once you move through those things and go through that process, you turn around and you can see that that prison door, it was always open. So hopefully you've gained some things from our time together today, and you can take some things away. And if you do get curious about those feelings, I would invite you to speak to somebody, and don't take the time that I did. I'd implore you, and I want to give you the gift of time so you can live the life that you truly want to lead, a life of eudaimonia, where you are flourishing on all levels, spiritually, emotionally, physically, because that's what we're here for. We're all beautiful human beings, and we're all here to flourish. Thank you.